Welcome to Taking Back Our Democracy, Take Back Our Democracy. This is the second in a series, occasional series, of programs throughout the year that focus on our voting rights, basically. The first show was dealing with money in politics. Real big problem. If anybody's, ever given to one campaign or party, they find that everybody else in that party finds you and you get all these requests. And, but there's other things that really directly influence, I think, our vote and the value of our vote. And one of those things is gerrymandering. And so today we're going to be speaking about gerrymandering. And with us again is Olivia Zink, who is the Executive Director of Democracy Now. Not Democracy, I say that
Open
wrong.
Democracy.
Open Democracy, sorry about that. See, it's another good group, which is a bipartisan group that really works training people and putting information out there on issues and how we can really improve the value of our vote. And also, this today, we have two representatives from the New Hampshire legislature, Representative Marjorie Smith. She's serving her 11th term in the New Hampshire House of Representatives, where she chairs the Judiciary Committee. And she has also chaired the Finance Committee in the past, and she represents Stratford County 6, where Durham and Madbury, New Hampshire are. And then Representative Ned Gordon, he's serving his first time, I'd say recently, because in the past he did serve in the legislature in both houses. And he retired last year as a circuit court judge. And he's a member of the Judiciary Committee. And he represents Grafton County 9, which is the towns of Bristol, Ashland, Alexandria, Bridgewater, and Grafton. So gerrymandering, what is it? And where did that word come from even, we could ask. Olivia, you want to talk a little bit about that?
Every 10 years, we redistrict, we draw the lines, our voting lines. And it's a process that we've done, and it's been in our Constitution and as the founding of the nation. So every 10 years, everyone is counted, and then we redraw the lines, our voting district lines.
And the term gerrymandering actually comes from quite a while ago, where we had Governor Gerry in Massachusetts, and he drew funny lines, and it looked like a salamander, actually. So they put the two words together, and we have gerrymandering. And both parties do it. Often whoever is in control at the time will try to set up so voting goes their way. But that can be very frustrating. Now, this current year, there was a bill in the legislature, which I believe, if I'm correct, passed both houses to set up like an independent commission to look at redistricting. And Marjorie, can you tell us a little bit about what happened with that?
Well, yes, you do need a little more background, I think, on the whole principle. We've had people divided into districts, congressional districts, state districts forever, but it wasn't really until the last half of the last century that the Supreme Court asserted a few guidelines that I think are pretty important, using the principle of one person, one vote, saying that districts really had to be divided in a way that kept the population somewhat equal, so that you didn't have one district with 100 people in it and another district with 1,000. So that concept of districts is old. The concept of trying to draw equal lines is a little newer. And every decade, the United States conducts a census. In the year ending in 0, we're about to conduct a census in 2020. And then governments, state and local governments, are faced with the task of making sure that the district lines conform to constitutional requirements, whatever those may be. So we had a bill in the 2019 session to establish an independent redistricting commission to say, instead of the politicians choosing who would get to vote for them, the voters should get to choose who they would vote for, and that district lines should be drawn in a fair and equitable way. We proposed an independent commission to do that. The House looked at the bill and made some sound amendments and passed the bill. The Senate further amended it and passed it unanimously. And we were really on the verge of joining a significant number of states in the country that had taken this step to make district lines more fair, when at the last minute, for reasons that only the governor could explain, he chose to veto the bill. And the reaction to that, on my part, was that I just immediately went and filed a new bill, because on the theory that the more you try, the better chance you have eventually of convincing enough people to join you, if at first you don't succeed. And that's why, yet again, the legislature is going to be considering this issue.
Ned, how did you feel about the bill for setting up an independent commission, and any other aspects of that you'd like to point to?
Well, I'm a co-sponsor of the bill. I actually represent a district which I often refer to as the Salamander. It has a district with Ashland, which I consider the head of the Salamander, Bristol, Bridgewater, and Alexandria, which are sort of the middle of the belly, and then Grafton is sort of the tail. It's a district that's designed, I think, in large part in the last redistricting to have a particular outcome, and perhaps I'm the beneficiary of that, being a Republican. But at the same time, you have towns that have absolutely no connection with each other. So I have Ashland, who sends their kids to one school district. I have 3 towns that send it to another school district, and Grafton to a third. And it may result in the right political outcome, but it doesn't necessarily create a district with a commonality of interest. And so I support the idea of redistricting. Redistricting is not an easy thing to accomplish in New Hampshire, I might add, at least in particular with regard to the House of Representatives, because you need one representative for every approximately 3,500 people now. But in doing that, you don't have towns that are all 3,500 people. It is a difficult task to begin with. But the idea that the party in power should decide that they're able to create districts that would enhance their ability to be elected, I just don't think is fair.
It's nice to hear you say that too, because of course I would agree with you, but so many people don't. And actually, redistricting, now, is it based, do I understand correctly, it's based on like registered voters versus like a population, or is it
No,
Or is it a
it's
population?
based on total population.
Okay.
It's based on census data. And sometimes the census data is a little misleading. One very clear example, I live in Durham, and on the appropriate day, the census is taken, and that census would include all of the students who are living in Durham. And at the time of the census, even though they might very well, most of them live somewhere else, perhaps, or their families at least live somewhere else. Another quirk is people in prisons. And whether they count and how they count. There are all these little impediments to having a clear picture, an easy way to make sure that we're counting everybody and counting them fairly. And this year we have an additional problem because of public statements that have been made by one or another political leaders, there are people who are going to be afraid to say, yes, I live here, wondering if perhaps they might get in trouble.
Mhm.
And so some of those people just won't report that they're here, but they still are here. They still, wherever here is, they still need services. They still should be counted. So there are all kinds of inequities that literally are central to the system. So trying to make it fair and equitable and logical is a very difficult task.
Yeah, and I
Olivia,
think we
yeah.
have a graph to show folks that you can draw the lines where you have the same number of voters, but you can get more of one registered party or one more of the other, or you can draw them in a very zigzag way to benefit people's political party. And what's important with the piece of legislation that Representative Smith talked about is that this would take party registration out of that. Those drawing the lines would not be able to use partisan data. It's really about making sure we're drawing the districts to be fair for every voter, and that one party is not taking political advantage in the process that happens every decade of drawing the lines.
And I think sometimes people in New Hampshire think we're pretty good. You know, we're the first in the nation primary, and we're many people, I think a higher percentage of the population is involved in politics than in many areas. But as Representative Gordon just said, he thinks of his district as a salamander. And we do have a graphic that shows, I remember a few years ago when they redid the executive council.
Yeah, well, if you look at the, the state has 5 executive council districts. The second district goes from sea to shining sea. It goes from the Connecticut River all the way across to the Atlantic in somewhat the shape of a salamander, if you look at it. And the only reason the district was drawn that way after the 2010 census was to pack as many Democrats into one district in order to increase the likelihood that the other districts would be able to be Republican. And that was the reason. And what Ned alluded to when talking about school districts, just in that example, is that there are other ways to do this that make sense, to talk about a community of interest. There are districts where, I think your district, you can't really drive, can you, from one town to another?
Well, as far as my district is concerned, first of all, there's people go to 3 different high schools, and to go from one high school to another would be 40 miles. You'd have to drive in order to do that. And between the communities, Grafton, there's no way to get from the other 4 towns to Grafton directly other than going through another county to get there on a tarred road. There's one dirt road that connects Alexandria and Grafton, but that's it. And they're, again, very different communities of interest.
I would imagine too, that much of New Hampshire is rural, and it becomes more difficult in a sense to draw up a good district that makes sense in a rural area, because you do have to meet certain, population.
Well, in the
Numbers.
House in particular, House districts cannot cross county lines. Senate districts do, and almost all the Senate districts that, except in the most compact cities, cross county lines. But in the House you can't, because House members are also serve as the legislative delegation for county government. So it might be that there are 2 towns that are very close to each other physically, that are very close in terms of their community of interest, but there's a county line that runs between them. So that raises another problem.
It's very interesting, go ahead, you're about ready to say something.
As I said earlier, the redistricting isn't an easy job to begin with, but you do need to establish communities of interest in doing that, and that's so. I think that's absolutely critical.
Now, Olivia, I imagine you work throughout the state.
Yeah, well, and I think it's important to know that there was a constitutional amendment to New Hampshire's constitution, whereas if communities have enough voters, they should be their own district. I live in the city of Franklin, and the city of Franklin is divided. Ward 3 votes with Northfield, and their representatives actually both live in Northfield. So Ward 3 residents and Wards 1 and 2 go with the community of Hill. So the city of Franklin really could have representatives not representing the city of Franklin if they're elected from the other communities. And I think it's complex with some of them have differing Senate districts, and what does it mean to be a voter in your district? What does it mean to say that my vote matters to my elected official, and that I wasn't drawn in a way where it was for political purpose, not because we want to feel like our votes matter when we cast our ballots, not that the lines have been rigged in a way where our vote doesn't matter. And I think that's what's so fundamental to this process, is by really ensuring that it's done fairly by 5 members, 5 Democrats, 5 Republicans, and 5 undeclared voters. You can have a sense that it was drawn by people that were not trying to game the system.
And we don't necessarily have a high turnout rate in the country, I'd say, on voting. It should be higher, I think. But I think part of the problem might be because some people, maybe in the gerrymandered districts, for instance, feel like their vote doesn't really count. Like, you could have 60% in one party, for instance, in this area, and less in there. And then when it comes to the people that are chosen, the party that actually has fewer people in it, registered in it, will have more seats in the legislature. So it must be frustrating, I think, for a lot of people in that.
We have to be honest that one of the problems is that we probably have too many House members. With 400 House members and a state population of, roughly 1.3 million plus, we have to be divided into sections that are awfully small. Of course, in my district, there are 5 people who represent Durham and Madbury, and we all run at large. But there's no question that there are realities that make it difficult. But even acknowledging that, we could run a far fairer system if we recognize that whichever party is in the majority after the election of after the census, is going to have a hard time resisting the pressure to skew the district lines, to construct district lines that are fair. And we ought to remove that pressure from the legislators and say, let's have another body there guiding us, so that whether it's Republican or Democratic, and this is true of both parties, it's not in any way something that's restricted to one
A
party.
bipartisan problem, I guess we could say.
And then it gets to one of the major objections that's raised to the redistricting bill is that the legislature constitutionally has authority to redistrict, and that wouldn't actually change under the bill, but we would be delegating that responsibility to another group. But I think it goes to this issue of even under the current system, and do people legitimately think that legislators are all getting together and sitting down and crunching numbers? The fact is that, from my experience, that's not really what happens. Generally, there might be a small committee of legislators that are appointed, but basically there are staff people who do the number crunching. I mean, and designing these districts and present it to the legislature. So it isn't as if we're taking these responsibilities away from the legislature. And under the current bill, the legislature still gets to vote and decide ultimately what the districts will be.
And the important thing is we've been speaking about referring to the census, and that's a once every 10-year process. So whatever redistricting comes up after the census is in there for 10 years.
And that has been true since 1790.
So it's a significant impact, and the
Yes.
better we can do it, the better off we all
So we
are.
first have to make sure that the census is as accurate as possible in counting every person. And that is a very difficult task. And this census is going to present some real problems, including perhaps not a sufficient amount of resources that have been directed to doing the census. And then, when we know what the basic numbers are, then comes the responsibility of drawing district lines.
And the,
And, you know, we have congressional district lines in this state. We have 2 congressional seats, so the state gets divided in half. And that's done, that line is roughly vertical line. Then we have and U.S. senators, of course, are the whole state, and the governor's the whole state, but then we have the executive council, 5 districts. We have the state senate, 24 districts. We have the House, in theory, 400 districts, except that we have multi-member districts, so they're not quite as many districts as there are representatives. And that doesn't count. In some of the counties, they're county districts. Not all of the counties. In Stratford County, for example, we elect all of our county people at large. But then we have cities and towns. And that's a lot of different districts.
and when it comes to gerrymandering, there was a recent case, well, it went to the Supreme Court, but I think got kicked out. Can you tell us?
You mean
a
the
little
North
bit about-
Carolina case?
Yeah.
That's an interesting case. There are a couple of cases, and one that where the decision clearly was that lines were drawn based on race. The court was quite clear that that is not acceptable, and that new district lines had to be drawn without regard to race. But the court said that as regard to partisan political parties, that was not, at the moment, at least under existing law and existing interpretation of the Constitution, that was not something that belonged in the jurisdiction of the U.S. Supreme Court, that was an issue that had to be decided state by state. And so that's all the more reason why we in New Hampshire, who generally try to do the right thing, should take responsibility for that. Mm-hmm. Now, that's my layman's interpretation. Of course, sitting to my left here is a distinguished former jurist and attorney, and he can now probably say all the things I said that were wrong.
No, I can't find anything that you said wrong. So.
But there was cases that were based on race that went to the Supreme Court, but there are also court cases that went on based on partisan makeup. And so in Wisconsin, there was they determined using a tool called the efficiency gap to measure what the partisan advantages were for those districts. And so that's one tool. And I know that there's a image to go up that talks about measuring each of New Hampshire's Senate districts based on this efficiency gap measure to see, is one district measured to be more partisan than others? And I think when you look at districts that have a efficiency gap measure of 20% or higher, it means that one party is definitely benefiting over another party. And that's what we try to limit when you draw the lines every 10 years is that you're not, if every one voter, one vote. That's what we get. And when you have systems where they're rigged in ways where some voters have more political power than others, that's what's unfair.
And there's even, shall I call them sub-terms under gerrymandering, like, what is it, packing and cracking, which I wasn't all that familiar with those terms. But
Well, I referred to one earlier, packing, in
Packing.
terms of getting as many of one party in one. And cracking's the opposite. It's splitting people
Splitting
up so that a particular group is a minority, which could be a majority or at least close to a majority if they're in one district, But if the lines are drawn in such a way, you can make sure that they're minority in each of the districts.
So unfortunately, there's been attempts in various directions to try to influence that we have to all become more aware of, I think.
And
too.
you must understand that not everyone agrees that, with us, that in fact fair and equitable district lines are desirable. I mean, there are many people who believe that this is one other vehicle that should be used to help concentrate strength on the part of one party or another. And people are working very hard. And they will work very hard in the next election to make sure that more people of their particular focus are elected in order to increase the likelihood that the subsequent district lines that are drawn continue that.
But I think 10 years ago when the district lines were drawn, they were done behind closed doors. So citizens and the public weren't able to put any public input into it. They would go to a hearing, no one would be able to answer their questions about the lines, no maps were presented for public input. And what I love about the proposal is that there is added transparency so that these lines will be presented and citizens can give public input to them and weigh in. Oh, this district doesn't fit with this community of interest. We go to different schools. Maybe we should be in different districts. And I think that gives the public a little more incentive to say there's transparency in the process.
And this bill requires that public transparency on several occasions, both at the beginning when people are figuring out what to do, and then when there's actually a proposal. So there should be ample opportunity to hear from people who want to be heard.
And I think we have more tools also at our, not exactly fingertips perhaps, but that can be utilized when you are looking at maps and deciding things. And having that, it's part of the process, but
Excuse me, I'm sorry.
that's okay. And that people will understand the process more. They'll see the input, as Olivia was saying, if it's open and transparent, and have access to that information and see how it's applied.
Well, computers have advanced in the last 10 years, and we have seen where you can put all kinds of different data into maps, whether it's party data or you can cut neighborhoods to put wealthy communities together and lower income communities together. There are ways where you can manipulate the map micro-targeted through computer data. And I think it's really important, and this bill lays out the criteria of what data can be put in to know what, and it's saying, no, we shouldn't be putting in partisan data, and we should be doing our very best to ensure that there is fairness in the process.
So again, you've introduced another bill since the prior one was vetoed. And also, I would say that it had bipartisan, well, we have bipartisan support right here putting it in, but also in the legislature.
We had unanimous support in the committees, which are both in the House and the Senate, which of course are bipartisan, and we had unanimous support in the Senate. We did not have unanimous support in the House.
Mm-hmm. But still, I mean, it's significant, not unanimous, but I think it was the majority, right?
Oh, of course it was a majority, yes, but it wasn't, but in the end it was not enough to override the governor's veto.
Because you need, what, 2/3 vote to override?
Yes.
So it makes it a little harder, but thank you for, are you both co-sponsoring the new one?
Yes.
Yeah, and thank you for doing that.
We
because it's so
also have
important.
a number of other people with us. Jeb Bradley, who's in the Senate and a Republican leader, is proudly a co-sponsor of this next bill, and we're pleased about that. And he can do that without in any way compromising his commitment to loyalty to his political party.
And that this bill will be coming up for a House committee on the 28th of this month in election law. And so for the listeners out there that might want to give your opinion, you can give that to the election law committee members as the hearing is on the 28th of this month, and coming to the State House to sign in favor or against the redistricting proposal. But we hope that you've listened to today's program and think this is a really good idea to make sure that we are creating a nonpartisan, independent advisory commission that is taking in public input as well as others to ensure that voters ultimately are being represented fairly.
And it's important for all of us really to take a part in this, to educate ourselves, listen to podcasts if that's your thing, or read about it, go to the internet and do a little research. And you can write a letter to the editor, for instance.
And it isn't a partisan issue. As I go around my district, clearly there are Republicans, Democrats are supportive of the idea of having independent redistricting.
I think the majority, I would assume the majority of the citizens are.
Well, an overwhelming majority of the legislators are supportive, just not quite enough to override the governor's veto.
And open democracy is on this issue as well as other ones affecting voting rights. And you can join them. What is it?
OpenDemocracyNH.org.
NH.org.
If you want to learn more about the work we're doing or to learn more about the bill, you can go to OpenDemocracyAction.org to learn more about the legislation that's pending. But I think it's really important as citizens take action to express your voice and your opinion on these public policy discussions that are happening at the state level and at the federal level. We barely touched on the congressional lines, but New Hampshire has 2 congressional districts, and out of the whole Congress, there's 90 congressional districts that are considered competitive. So there's 345 that aren't. And so when we look at least New Hampshire has 2 competitive districts of that pool of 90, and I think it's important to think about, is it competitive? Is it compact? And all of these different criteria are being held to a standard. And it's important that we evaluate different proposals based on that.
And I have a theory, I don't know, that I think most states are probably purple, as they say. But depending how things are set is whether, it's red or blue. And the gerrymandering influences that and that kind of thing.
Well,
and that more people agree on more things than we often think they do.
I think that's probably so. We're a purple state. There are a number of purple states. And the people who represent those states reflect disparate views, understanding that in a democratic society, ideally, we hear different views, we value different views, and we try to find common ground. Sometimes we're more successful at that than other times.
But such is life, right?
Yes.
In many ways. So, I'd recommend, too, that people get to know their representatives and their senators, because we have so many. I mean, the
Yes.
plus side is that you can get to know them.
That's true.
And you might even bump into them on the street, and they might not recognize you, too. So, get to know them, how they feel about issues, share how you feel about them. I think that's
Right.
good.
For one representative for every 3,500 people or so in the state, it's easy. Generally, your representatives are accessible. Generally, in your community, there's no reason why you can't be in touch. Let them know how you feel, and it's important for a representative to hear from their constituents. It makes a huge difference.
I tell people often, I was born in Washington, D.C., lived there till I was 11, then moved to Maryland, just a couple miles from the district line. But my parents, having spent many years there as adults, they didn't have the right to vote back then.
That's correct.
And
They still don't have
voting
a voting
representative,
member
yeah.
in Congress.
and that, I had to sort of prod them as a teenager, like, go register, Ma, Dad, you can do it now, let's get out there. And so I was sort of amazed when we moved to New Hampshire about how accessible, really, our representatives and our senators are to us. And we should, be thankful for that and take advantage of it too.
Well, and the change in how we all communicate with each other is significant. Anybody can go online on the New Hampshire website and then the legislative website and see, for example, the list of the 1,000 bills that the legislature is looking at right now. And it's likely that one of those bills, not 10 or 100, are bills of interest to you. All of that matters in terms of how you participate in the democratic society. And then when you get to the opportunity to vote for someone, that's where redistricting matters, to make sure that you're in a district that is fair and equitable.
Would you like to add anything to that?
No, I just agree, obviously, with my chair, Representative Smith. It's important to be involved, and people are involved in New Hampshire. I was in committee with Representative Smith yesterday. When I got home, I had 100 some odd emails
Oh, wow.
in my legislative account, all asking me to either advocate for or against particular bills, mostly in the Judiciary Committee. So people are involved in this state, very much so. And the more they are, the better. It's so much better for them to be in America, in New Hampshire, to be on that email trying to communicate with me than they are to be out on the streets as they are in other places in the world.
And I think that the reforms such as the Independent Redistricting Committee are so critical this year because we don't know who's going to win the election in November and which party will be in control next year when they will be doing the redistricting process. So to say in this year where we don't know what's going to happen next year, we want to make sure that there is equal representatives of Republicans, Democrats, and undeclared voters that are drawing the initial map to present to the legislature.
Anything you'd like to say to the people out there?
I always use a quote that Granny D. Doris Haddock said is, democracy is something that we do. And so please consider participating, following legislation, educating your neighbors, learning more, and sharing the information with your friends and neighbors.
And I want to thank our guests, Representative Marjorie Smith and Representative Ned Gordon, for taking the time to come here. I know you have a busy day. You even had a committee meeting that went pretty close to the taping time of this. And we appreciate your efforts. Sometimes I think we don't realize how much effort goes into, what is it, $100 a year job?
Well, we're not doing it for the money.
And I want to thank you for tuning in. I'm your host, Rosemary Lanier. And once we say our final goodbye here, we're going to put up some information on different ways you can get involved in case you're not familiar with, with the different groups and the different activities that are out there. So thanks for tuning in again. And hopefully, in a few months, we'll have a third show for you that continues our discussion on really how to enhance our democracy and make our votes count. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yes, thank you very much.